Hello, and welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. Tonight, we continue our coverage of the Washington State Supreme Court races and the issues shaping some of the year's most closely watched judicial races. Plus, we take a closer look at some of the pros and cons surrounding data center projects in Washington State. We begin tonight with the race for position 1 on the Washington Supreme Court. Candidate Scott Edwards, a Seattle-based tax attorney, recently joined me to talk about some of the key issues facing the High Court. How would you describe your judicial philosophy, especially in cases involving constitutional limits, separation of powers, and taxpayer issues?
Sure. Well, my judicial philosophy, I think, is pretty straightforward. The role of a judge is to interpret the law as written and in accordance with the language of the Constitution as written, not to inject policy preferences and to reason backwards from a desired outcome. I say, that's exactly how as an attorney, you can't inject your policy views. I have to advise my clients on this is what the law is. When there are areas where either the law exceeds constitutional authority, when a rule exceeds statutory authority, or when there's a dispute with the state over those things, that's when the part of my practice gets into controversy work, which leads to cases before the state Supreme Court. That's an area where the court only takes cases on a discretionary basis, and one of the criteria is whether it's a matter of substantial public importance. One of the reasons why I've handled so many state Supreme Court cases, because taxes tend to be a matter of substantial public importance, and making sure that the government follows the law as written and within the constraints of the Constitution is the fundamental role of the court within our system of government, which has 3 co-equal branches and a system of checks and balances. And the court's role is to serve as that check and balance against legislative and executive overreach, not to be an additional legislature or an additional executive.
So, Justice Colleen Medley, she was recently appointed by Governor Bob Ferguson after working under him in the state attorney general's office. She's also received campaign donations from people inside the AGO, endorsements from people inside the AGO, and ultimately the AGO is going to be the party defending the income tax should it reach the state Supreme Court. I was wondering what concerns, if any, should voters have about that appointment and Justice Medley's background?
Well, the history of our state constitution, when we were a territory, judges were appointed by the territorial governor. One of the concerns people had with that at the time that we became of statehood is the concern that judges appointed by the executive will carry out the desires of the executive. And that's a reason why Washington's Constitution provides for judges to be elected by the people, not to be appointed by the executive. And one of the reasons that I'm running is because there's developed a pattern in Washington state where sitting judges will retire before the end of their term, the term that the people elected them to, in order to allow the governor to appoint their successor and for that person to run as an incumbent. Frequently in that first time around, and also in subsequent times, they draw no challenger. And that undermines the whole process and takes away the people's right to vote for their judges. That's one of the reasons why I'm running for the Supreme Court. Give people a choice, and I'm running to restore independence, to focus on a principled analysis and the rule of law. And like we've talked about, interpreting statutes in the Constitution as written, not from a policy perspective.
Mhm. In a lot of candidates on both sides have pushed in their TVW voter guide statements that they want judicial independence. You're arguing that the appointment process undermines that. I'm wondering, do you see the state Supreme Court as already being a partisan judiciary?
So, well, the state Supreme Court, as it's currently comprised, is recognized nationally as one of the most activist, progressive Supreme Courts in the country. They haven't shied away from injecting their own policy preferences into Supreme Court decisions instead of interpreting the statutes and the Constitution as written. Again, that's exactly why I'm running for Supreme Court, is to get away from that policy focused decision making and get us back to a focus on the rule of law. One of the things that was interesting to me as I was trying to craft my voter statement, which is limited to 200 words, is I think that the words fair and independent are words that you will probably see in all 16 voter statements.
Mhm.
I think how those words are intended to be conveyed by different candidates vary quite a bit. And I think one of the things that probably sets me apart from most of the 16, certainly not all, but many of the 16 people who are running, is to be clear about what I mean by that. And that is to focus on statutes and the Constitution as written, and not to bring a policy bent and read either into or out of things that aren't there.
Mhm. So, given some of the concerns around Melody's appointment that we just talked about, what do you think the line is between like normal legal and government experience and an appearance of fairness issue that might require a justice to step aside on a case?
So, well, the question of recusal, I think, is a issue that arises in the context of a specific case that would come before the court. I think the question of of choosing a candidate for that position is a broader and different question, and the appointing as your it's hard to say that the governor's first appointment to the Supreme Court, because the governor shouldn't be making any appointments to the Supreme Court, but when the governor makes an appointment to the Supreme Court of a person who, for most of their career, has been the governor's top policy executor when the governor was the attorney general, I think calls into question the notion of independence.
Hmm.
It really goes to the heart of the concern within the Constitution of rejecting the notion of the governor appointing judges, and at the very least there's the appearance that and the suspicion that somebody whose career has been serving a particular individual, when that individual appoints them to office, that they will continue to have that focus in the performance of their office.
And given what you just said, in the fact that she had worked under Ferguson, Ferguson signed the income tax. There's emails between Senator Peterson, who wrote the income tax, and the AGO on trying to get the matter to the court to overturn prior precedent. Do you think that Justice Medley should recuse herself should the income tax issue reach the Supreme Court?
Yeah, that's a debate that is premature, that I don't want to weigh into.
Hmm.
And the reality is you're going to hear from other people that my experience as a tax attorney,
Hmm.
and particularly my experience challenging the capital gains tax, would be cause for me to recuse myself. I think the arguments for with respect to either of us in that regard are premature and would need to be dealt with, if and when that's something that comes before the court.
And along the same line, is that an issue that you would have to actively consider in the future if elected?
It certainly is an issue. I think the analysis is different because typically the question is whether the attorney or the attorney's firm is representing a party to the litigation.
Mhm.
One of my former partners, was elected to the Thurston County Superior Court a number of years ago, and I had numerous conversations with him as he was trying to navigate and understand that issue, and ultimately, one of the things that he decided that during at a minimum his first year on the bench as a trial court judge, he would recuse himself from any matter in which any attorney at the firm was representing a party without regard to whether he knew anything at all about that representation.
So a lot of voters are going to be looking at the Quinn ruling as we head into this election, given the political climate and the issues that could be heading into the court in the next year or so. You helped litigate that case. Um, what should voters be looking at on that ruling as they consider who to vote for in this election?
Yeah, I don't know that looking at past rulings will help voters to decide who they should vote for in the election. And I'm not sure, I'd be skeptical as to whether the Quinn case would be a significant case impacting the analysis and ruling in a challenge to the income tax. The ultimate ruling in the Quinn case is that the capital gains tax is an excise tax imposed on the activity that gives rise to the gain rather than on the income received. Uh, there's not a similar type of structure in the income tax, so I don't anticipate there being any likelihood that anybody's going to argue that the income tax is actually an excise tax. So in that regard, I'm not sure that Quinn is going to be particularly meaningful one way or the other in that litigation.
As the demand for artificial intelligence and cloud computing continues to grow, so does the debate over the future of data centers in Washington state. Supporters say these facilities create jobs, generate tax revenue, and power much of the digital economy. Critics, however, raise concerns about energy use, water consumption, and the strain large projects could place on local communities. Tonight, we sit down with the Data Center Coalition's Dan DiOrio to discuss new restrictions, tax policy changes, and what they say is at stake for Washington's digital economy. You're the Vice President of State Policy for the Data Center Coalition. Before we start, can you kind of tell us a little bit about your organization?
Sure. Well, the Data Center Coalition, we are the national membership association for the data center industry. So we have 40 plus members, which are leading data center owners and operators, as well as companies that lease large amounts of data center capacity.
So, to start broadly, why should Washington communities see data centers as valuable infrastructure rather than just large private tech projects?
Sure. Well, it's important to remember that data centers are everything that we do every day. It's every telehealth appointment, every electronic healthcare record, online classrooms, every online purchase, banking and financial transactions, 911 geolocation services, state and local governments, you name it. But most importantly, I think Washington has a significant history with data center development, and that's really shown in the economic benefits that the industry has brought. That includes 127,700 in total employment contribution in the state as of 2024. With that is $17.4 billion in labor income, 33.8 billion to Washington GDP, and then I think most importantly, 1.5 billion in taxes to the state government in Washington and 883 million in taxes to local governments in Washington. These are significant economic development projects. They bring jobs, they bring labor income. These are good paying jobs. They bring economic activity, and they bring vital tax revenue to both the state and communities.
hmm So, critics argue that data centers use enormous amounts of electricity and could force utility providers to build more generation, transmission, or substation capacity. Was wondering how you think communities should make sure that ordinary ratepayers aren't responsible for picking up all these costs without just banning the projects altogether.
Well, it's important to remember first off that data center electricity use is reflective of all of us. Consumers and businesses are demanding access to digital infrastructure. We'll create twice as much data in the next 5 years as we did in the previous 10. The average household has 21 connected devices. When you laptops and phones, watches, smart TVs, ring doorbells, garage doors, lights, my oven is connected to Wi-Fi. All of that requires digital infrastructure. I think there's a perception that all of this is for AI and this is an AI profit grab. It's a growth driver, there's no question. The vast majority of data centers in Washington, but also being built and put into operation today, are for cloud infrastructure. And that's the underpinning of the 21st century economy. But for our part as an industry, we are fully committed to paying our full cost of service for electricity. We expect utilities and regulators to help ensure that that's the case. We are an end user, a customer. When we get our bill, we expect that that is our bill in full, that no other costs are being passed along to ratepayers that should be assigned to us. Now, we're not resting on our laurels on that. We've been supportive of contracts and policies throughout the country to ensure utilities have certainty there and the right types of mechanisms so that costs are allocated appropriately. But we're in this high growth period and we're experiencing electricity load growth because of data centers, but also manufacturing and electrification, importantly, of vehicles, homes, businesses, and industries, and hydrogen production. So it's imperative upon all of us to make vital, needed investments in our electricity grid. And I think for data centers, what we see is that data centers and large loads can help put downward pressure on rates. So because you're a large load, you absorb more of those fixed costs, the needed infrastructure maintenance that hasn't been done for about 20 years. And then you're able to put downward pressure on rates for others. We see it in Indiana, where Indiana Michigan Power announced they're lowering rates because of data center revenue coming in, and that's rates for residential ratepayers. Georgia Power, same thing. DTE Energy in Michigan, Entergy down along the Gulf Coast. Even PG&E in California, of all places, has said we've been able to keep rates 11% lower because of data centers. So there's tremendous opportunity here for data centers to facilitate investment in the grid, to pay for that investment, and we are fully committed to that.
So, state lawmakers here in Washington earlier, a few months ago, they were considering a bill that could have required data centers to front some of the costs in terms of expanding the electrical grid, water use, and other stuff, so it wouldn't fall on ratepayers. It didn't go anywhere. It was a short session, so they're probably going to pick it up next year. But was wondering what you think. Should developers be required to pay the full cost of the infrastructure required to serve these data centers when they're building them?
Absolutely, absolutely. The costs that are attributable to the data center should be borne by the data center. There is no question. We were heavily engaged in that bill, and we provided language throughout the process saying, hey, this is how it should be structured based on best practices from throughout the country. DCC has been party to settlements in utility tariff cases throughout the country, saying, yes, this is a framework that works. It makes sense. Indiana Michigan Power, like I mentioned, that was the first large load tariff in the country. And now we're seeing the fruits of that with rates being lowered. So it's important, I think, that throughout these discussions, I think lawmakers, should focus on best practices. We raised significant concerns about many other provisions that were being put into that package that were ultimately going to probably increase costs, but also were unworkable and were going to make operations in Washington significantly challenging because they didn't reflect realistic capabilities. And so we strongly urge lawmakers to focus on the tariff provisions that make the most sense, that are based on best practices that have been successful. Unfortunately, the bill did not get to that point, but we are fully committed to being that engaged stakeholder in 2027 to find a workable policy that reflects realistic operational conditions, but ensures that ratepayers are protected and costs are allocated appropriately.
So, at the end of the legislative session, to help close a multi-billion dollar budget deficit, the state majority had eliminated a tax exemption for replacement equipment at data centers. And there was a lot of concerns among Republicans, especially those representing areas in central and eastern Washington where more of these data centers are, that eliminating the tax exemption would cause these facilities to want to move away once it comes times to replace this equipment. I was wondering your thoughts on that and whether or not the elimination of the tax cut or the tax credit pushes away future projects from coming to Washington.
I think it will, and I think it will have a dramatic impact on Washington. And there's a couple of reasons why. These are large capital purchases. And they're rolling capital expenses. The servers change over on average about every 3 to 5 years. That's about their useful life, as well as evolutions in technology. And I think that's lost in this debate. The new chips coming out, the new servers coming out are something like 25% more energy efficient. So you can do a lot more compute with less in that facility. And I think, basically Washington created a disincentive to change over that equipment. There have been long-standing sales tax exemptions for manufacturing equipment. And what that does is it defrays some of the cost of the inputs to then generate the economic activity and the tax revenue on the output side. And the same applies to data centers. So I think the state really made a very strong mistake. I think they are going to lose investment. And quite frankly, they're going to have old, inefficient equipment in their data centers. And that's why I think it's mind-boggling that the state basically said, hey, we don't want you to change over your equipment. We're going to create a disincentive for you to do that. And I think, when it comes down to tax revenue and closing a budget gap, I mean, 1.5 billion in taxes to Washington state government in 2024, and that's actually net of incentives. It's based on data from PwC, publicly available data in 2024, and they net out the incentives there. So the industry still contributed $1.5 billion to the state government. And so I think it was an unfortunate mistake. I think it's going to have significant repercussions in the state for data center development.
What do you think the elimination of that tax exemption means for communities in central and eastern Washington that were rather small before, but in recent years have seen significant economic development because of these data center projects? What's it going to mean in 5 years when they need to replace this equipment? And if they leave, what would that mean to the communities?
I think you'll see a loss of vital tax revenue for the community, that $883 million in taxes to local governments. I think it is really clear that data centers like in Quincy, for example, have had a dramatically positive impact on that community. The revenue they generate, the jobs that they generate as well, has really been put back into infrastructure, into services, into schools in that community. Data centers, I think, pay average double the average county wage in Quincy. This is a tremendous economic opportunity. I think it's going to really throw in doubt whether or not these facilities can continue to expand in that region and whether or not those facilities, for example, the multi-tenant facilities that lease out space to other tenants, it's their tenants that get the sales tax exemption because their tenants have their proprietary servers there. I think it's going to be in doubt whether or not those tenants will renew and stay in Washington. And so I think it's going to have a significant impact in the future.
Would you say that in trying to solve the state's own budget problems, that they're creating more problems for the localities?
I think they are, right? What this comes down to is local economic development opportunities. There are communities throughout the state in which data centers really fit their economic development needs very well. And we've seen that very much be the case in a place like Quincy, especially as I mentioned. For some communities, maybe a data center development doesn't fit their needs as well. But by doing this, taking this state level action, the state, I think, has inadvertently hurt local governments and their ability to attract the projects that best fit their needs. And so I do think that this was a short-term reaction that will have long-term repercussions.
So, water use has become one of the biggest concerns around large data centers, especially in communities already worried about aquifers, rivers, and long-term growth, especially in Spokane with their aquifer underneath the city. How much water do modern data centers actually require, and what safeguards should local governments look for before approving one?
Well, I think the facts and the data have to matter here, especially the context as well. Data centers are amongst the most efficient water users in the economy. We use less in semiconductor manufacturing. We use less in food and beverage production. We use less water than what's lost to water leaks in municipal water systems on an annual basis. We know in places like Virginia, the world's largest data center market, 83% of data centers use as much, if not less, water than a large commercial office building. In Texas, the second largest market in the country, data centers are less than 0.5% of the state's overall water use in 2025. This is an industry that's been actively deploying water efficient cooling technologies for years. They're not new, they're not novel. They've really developed innovative technologies and techniques that have been incorporated into building designs for years. Or even in the case of Microsoft, which has had that facility in Quincy that needed to be upgraded, they upgraded it and they put in a water reuse facility as well, together with the city of Quincy, paid for it in order to facilitate more recycled water and water reuse in the community. So this is an industry that I think, despite all the noise, has very much always used water sustainably. I think it's absolutely fair for communities, and communities should ask questions. People should ask questions. Hey, how is this project going to use resources sustainably? What does this project mean for our community? Does it fit our economic development goals? But I think what's very clear is that this is an industry that develops sustainably. Companies like Microsoft have significant water positivity goals. So to help restore more watersheds, put more water back in, into those watersheds than what they use on an annual basis, and they are actively, achieving significant progress towards those goals by 2030. So we'll continue to be an efficient water user and prioritize resource sustainability.
And finally, tonight, as lawmakers debate how to regulate the rapid growth of data centers, questions are emerging about who should pay for the infrastructure needed to support them and what protections are necessary for ratepayers, water resources, and local communities. Supporters argue data centers are critical to the modern economy, while critics warn that without proper safeguards, ordinary customers could end up bearing the cost. Tonight, I sit down with the Northwest Energy Coalition's Zach Baker to discuss energy demand, water use, utility rates, and the guardrails they believe Washington should put in place around future data center projects. Supporters often argue that data centers can bring property tax revenue, utility revenue, and construction jobs to local communities, bolstering their economies. From a taxpayer standpoint, what benefits are real and which ones tend to be overstated?
Sure, yeah. So each community is gonna see different benefits as well as potential concerns or costs. And so I think it's important for communities to be really thinking about what makes sense for their community. And you're right that there have been some uh, benefits with data centers around increased jobs, particularly in the near-term construction jobs. There has been some evidence that there aren't as many long-term jobs created as part of data center builds. Um, and then there's also some local property tax benefits, as well as just general economic development in communities. But that also needs to be weighed with some of the potential concerns or drawbacks of large developments. And that can be potential environmental impacts, potential community like land use impacts, as well as the ratepayer issues that we talked about earlier, where potentially there could be increased electricity costs for folks. So those are the types of things that communities need to weigh in assessing whether a data center should be hosted in their community. And then also you mentioned taxpayers. There are some state level tax incentives that are provided to data centers, and there are also sometimes local communities will provide tax incentives to try to attract the data centers. And so the question that communities should be thinking about is like, are they getting the most bang for the buck for those tax incentives? and whether those tax incentives are um, the way that folks want to be spending the public dollars to attract these data centers.
And so Dan Dirio with the Data Center Coalition, he told me that the industry is committed to paying its full cost of service. From your perspective, what needs to be written into the law or these utility tariffs or contracts to make sure that actually happens?
Yeah, for sure. So it's really crucial that they do pay for the full cost of their service so that it's not on the backs of regular ratepayers. And typically, if a data center is going to connect to a utility needs to have a policy in place to be able to identify what the costs are to have that data center receive service from the utility and then ensure that the data center is paying all of those costs. And the typical way to do that is what's called a tariff or a separate rate class for data centers that can ensure that the data centers would be paying for all of the costs of their um, service from the utility. And we did, as part of an effort in the last legislative session, try to require that all utilities in the state of Washington have a policy like that in place.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, that bill, which had a lot of other key guardrails in it, did not end up passing the legislature. And I think that's also why we're seeing some of the conversations that we're seeing across the state in communities, wondering how to manage and handle the situation with the rapid growth in data centers. And so I'm hopeful that the legislature will uh, take that up again, that idea and many of the other ideas that were in that bill, take it back up again in the uh, upcoming legislative session so
Mhm.
that we can get guardrails in place across the state to provide some level, a baseline level of assurances to
Mhm.
communities across the state. And then communities can obviously go above and beyond whatever the state ends up doing.
I think the Trump administration has brought up the idea of requiring data centers to pay for the electrical infrastructure and to set up their own power stations, essentially, kind of along the lines that you're talking about with the tariffs. What's your organization's take on that? Is that something that would work, or is that something along the lines of what you guys are talking about that just needs a little bit more legs?
Yeah, so part of the original proposal from the Trump administration was just to basically having the data centers voluntarily agree to pay for the costs of their electricity, and voluntary commitments not enough in this case. The
Hmm.
regular ratepayers need certainty that the data centers are going to pay for their costs, and so that was part of why we pushed for legislation in the last session to make sure that there were protections in place. Um, One piece of what you mentioned is the data centers bringing their own energy, like basically building their own power plants to be able to power themselves. And so that is another way that they can get power. The other way is through the utility, which we talked about. Um, there are some challenges with that. So one is if they Washington has very strong climate and clean energy goals. And so if they were to rely on fossil fuels, which a lot of the data centers are turning to, at least in the interim, there is a chance that it would be much harder to meet our climate and clean energy goals. We tried to plug some loopholes in Washington's clean electricity law during last legislative session to make sure that at least any data center that is building their own power would need to meet Washington's clean electricity law the same timeline. that a utility needs to meet the Washington Clean Electricity Law. So that is one guardrail that we were able to get in.
When you're talking about in terms of cleaner energy and the utility providers competing against the data centers if they were to build their own projects, their own energy products, are you speaking more so to alluding to maybe a situation where the state wants to build more wind farms, but if all of a sudden you have a lot of data centers building those wind farms and using the energy for the data centers, then the state won't approve as many wind farms just for the regular utility providers that's going to us. So that they have to compete more for those projects.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And then, so if they were to stay on the utility, Diorio cited cases along the East Coast where these data centers put downward pressure on rates by spreading those costs across a larger customer base. Is that realistic in Washington, or does it really depend on what tariffs are in those contracts?
Yeah, it really depends on what tariffs are in place and what policies are in place. And that's the key is making sure that there are policies in place that provide the protections. There is that is the key. It depends what policy is in place, and that's why it's so important to get the right policy in place.
So, another large concern around data centers is water consumption. I know you guys deal more with energy, but that goes along the same lines. I was wondering what safeguards should be in place for data centers regarding water use, especially in areas, say, the city of Spokane, for example, they're considering a moratorium. I mean, the city sits on top of a large aquifer that serves the entire region, so there's concerns that maybe a data center could pollute that aquifer. Is there grounding to that claim, or is it kind of taking things out of context?
Sure, yeah, and maybe as a bridge from the energy conversation to this
Hmm.
water piece, I think we don't know enough about the data center industry right now because a lot of the information is not public.
Hmm.
And so as a baseline guardrail and protection, there needs to be transparency about both energy use and water use, how much is being used and where it's coming from. And so for the water side, it's really important to understand how much water is being used, when it's being used, and the source of that water. There have been reports in different places across the country about potential groundwater contamination. So, understanding what is happening could help us then best fashion the regulations and um, uh, policies that are needed to ensure that communities are protected. Understanding the uh, in the bill that we were trying to advocate for in the last legislative session, there were requirements for reporting on water usage uh, and also ensuring that there would be ongoing reporting. Um, there's a key in that um, for communities to be able to assess a project at the start, they need to have that information at the time, either prior to or at the time that a permit application is filed. Uh, so that there can be a conversation about what potential impacts there might be. And then uh, there also needs to be ongoing reporting so that folks can understand what's happening and be able to monitor any potential impacts, some of the impacts you mentioned. And there's been a lot of conversation about how much water data centers are using, and having that information is the key to be able to have a deeper conversation about what needs to happen to ensure that we are protecting watersheds.
So, uh, along the same lines with the water resource concern, you hear the data center industry often cite the fact that They argue that data centers use far less water than it's often cited golf courses. The average golf course uses way more water, they say, than a modern data center. Was wondering how you guys respond to that and whether you guys have an idea of how much water data centers use as an industry, and whether or how that might change over the years ahead. Because at the same time, Diorio brought up the fact that the amount of data that we store or need to store over the next 5 years is going to be more than the last 10 years.
Yeah, so I think I'd go back to the transparency piece is truly understanding how much water they're using. Uh, it's very hard for a community member to find out how much water is being used. And so it is important to be able to see what it is and then be able to have a conversation about it. I've seen estimates all over the map. Um, and also technologies are changing quickly, which impacts how much water is used. And so um, the bottom line is it's really whether it's the amount of a golf course or the amount of a higher estimate, uh, it's it's using water, and many times data centers are kind of clustered in the same area, and so there could be multiple uh, aggregated impacts from data centers using water in the same area, and it's really important that we have a better understanding of how much water is being used so that we can have that conversation of how to best protect watersheds.
Is that is that a concern that you think is overplayed at all, or should that be should that water resource consumption should that be shared across other industries as well? Because it's not something that I had really heard come into play until the conversation around data centers really started heating up the last year or two.
Yeah, uh it's a hard question to answer because I haven't seen all of the data from the data centers. Like I've said, I've seen very high estimates from good sources of information. And then what you said about the data centers saying that they're only using a little bit of water. So we need to have some baseline level of
Mhm.
information that we can all talk about. And water is really important in Washington and in the West. And so I don't think concerns are overblown. I think it's important that we have a conversation about how much water is being used and what needs to happen about it.
That's all for this edition of Washington in Focus Daily. For more stories that we didn't get to, visit thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.